Richard Dawkins is tremendously popular. His book, The God Delusion, was a runaway bestseller, and his lesser-known works, such as The Blind Watchmaker, have been very popular amongst those who espouse atheism. In these books, he attempts to provide philosophical arguments for the non-existence of God, and he gets a lot of positive feedback. For example, on Amazon.com, you have hundreds of glowing reviews, giving him 5 stars and speaking glowingly of his work. I've observed, however, that the scholarly community is decidedly less enthused about his work, in particular modern philosophers. For example, Alvin Plantinga, one of the foremost modern philosophers, one of the most well-known certainly, has said that Dawkins' work was amateurish. It was sloppy philosophy, and he said that he was tempted to call it sophomoric, except that that would have been an insult to sophomores. The secular magazine Philosophy now issued a scathing review of the book, lamenting the carelessness, just a tremendous sloppiness in his work. Even the atheistic philosopher Michael Ruse, one of the foremost atheistic philosophers in modern times, has said, and I quote, "The God Delusion makes me embarrassed to be an atheist." The New York Times has likewise, well, this is not a philosophical work, I realize, but the New York Times wrote a review that was decidedly lukewarm, and that was by a reviewer who was very familiar with modern philosophy. Why is it that these scholars are not as enthused about Dawkins' work as a lot of lay people are? Well, I think that's because people tend to be swayed by what are sweet-sounding arguments without necessarily looking at them more closely. And indeed, these people who are knowledgeable about philosophy understand the weaknesses in Dawkins' work, even when they likewise espouse atheism. For example, consider the argument from design. Dawkins, with regard to biological design, says, you know, biological design is an illusion. You just have the appearance of design. Evolution is more than sufficient to explain this appearance of design. I'm going to let that argument slide for now. I think there's a lot of serious flaws in that argument, but for the sake of discussion, let's assume that to be true for now. He goes on to say that you also have the appearance of design in the physical constants of the universe. And this is the cosmic fine-tuning argument that I've discussed in some of my previous videos. He acknowledges that there's the appearance of fine-tuning in the cosmos. But he says, you know, we just gotta hope, we just gotta believe that there is a naturalistic explanation for it. In other words, he doesn't attempt to explain it. He just says, we just gotta keep looking for a way to explain it away without resorting to God. Now that's poor philosophy. That's starting with a goal in mind and arguing toward that goal instead of proceeding based on the evidence. Now Dawkins also invokes the anthropic principle as well as the multiple universe theory, both of which I covered in previous videos. So if I say that the anthropic principle has not gained widespread acceptance amongst philosophers because it really is sloppy thinking, it's a sloppy way of dismissing an argument rather than confronting it. And second, the multiple universe theory not only does not explain away the appearance of design, it's also completely unevidenced. In other words, there's just no evidence for these multiple universes. Dawkins also argues that God is too complex to plausibly exist. First, I want to talk about this common misconception that people have about Dawkins' argument. And second, I want to talk about how his argument fails. First, the misconception. In a previous video, I mentioned that many people have come to me and said, you can't postulate God's existence. By doing that, you're postulating something that's more complex than what you're trying to explain. Now that's invalid reasoning for reasons that I gave in another video. So if I say that there's nothing invalid about postulating a cause that is more complex than its effect, we do it all the time. Second, we don't have good reason to believe that God is complex, contrary to what Dawkins says. This is why his argument has failed to impress modern philosophers. For example, the whole argument of complexity assumes that God must be more complex than what he's creating because he has the knowledge of the universe. In other words, if he knows everything about the universe, he needs to have somehow encoded that knowledge, and therefore he must be incredibly complex, and the more complex he is, the more improbable it is that he exists. Now that fails on numerous ways. One, and this is something I also mentioned in the previous video, is that his argument assumes that God is composed of physical parts that interact with each other. In other words, he's likening God to some computer or some machine, and of course, the more that the computer knows, the more information the computer embodies, the more parts it must have interacting with each other, and the more complex it must be. But that's not what God is like. God is spirit. God is incorporeal. It's invalid to take properties of physical objects and say that non-physical objects must follow those same properties. By the way, this is not just speculation on my part. Dawkins himself says what he means by complexity. He says, and I quote, Entities that are complex enough to be intelligent are products of an evolutionary process. Notice what he's saying here. He's not proving it, he's stating it baldly. This is the assumption he comes in. He says that if it's complex, if it's intelligent, then it must have evolved. That's not clear thinking. That is circular reasoning. He's assuming that if you assume that something that's intelligent must have evolved, then of course you're going to say that God doesn't exist. But he provides no substantiation for this claim. The problem is that he's doing this whole issue to a materialist set of lenses. He's just assuming that everything that exists must be materialist in nature, and so he brings that perspective and dismisses God based on that predisposition. That's invalid reasoning. Now, some people have said to me, well, you haven't proven that such a non-material being can exist. You have not proven that. I have a number of responses to that. First of all, I don't have to prove it. If Dawkins is saying that God must consist of complicated parts, of a complex arrangement of parts, then it's up to him to show that God cannot be physical in nature. In other words, if you're going to say that there's a contradiction here, it's up to you to substantiate that contradiction. All I have to do is show that it doesn't necessarily follow. Second, there are multiple independent arguments for the existence of non-corporeal beings. For example, the mind-body duality and the existence of human free will. Because free will is incompatible with a mechanistic view of the universe. Now, you might disagree with those viewpoints, but the point is you do have independent reasons for believing it. This is not just some unsubstantiated assumption here. So Dawkins asserts that the supposed complexity of God makes his existence highly improbable. Now, for the sake of argument, let's set aside all the reasons I gave for why God is not necessarily complex. For the sake of argument, let's grant that he is. Does it logically follow that this complexity means that God's existence is highly improbable? Of course not. Careful thinkers understand that probability is assessed based on the entirety of one's background knowledge, not based on one fact alone. What do I mean? Well, for example, let's suppose that 1/3 of all Americans has a sexually transmitted disease. Does it logically follow that you could point to any man on the street and say, there's a 1/3 chance that this man has an STD? Of course not. What if that man had been raised in an Amish community, for example? Or what if he was a monk? That probability would decrease dramatically. In the same way, you cannot take this one fact, the supposed complexity of God, and based on that fact alone insist that God's existence is highly improbable. You need to consider the entirety of the background knowledge and the entirety of background arguments. For example, what about the cosmological argument, the noological argument, axiological argument, historical arguments for the existence of God? You cannot simply dismiss those. Every modern philosopher understands these arguments. And that is why it should be no surprise that modern philosophers are dismissive of Dawkins' work, why they regard his work as being sophomoric and amateurish. Dawkins also launches into an extended diatribe about the evils committed in the name of religion. Now, I, for one, will not deny that a great many wrongdoings have been committed due to religion. In fact, I openly admitted that in some of my previous videos. The problem is that he fails to provide a balanced viewpoint, as any careful, critical thinker should do. He talks about all these wrongdoings that have been committed due to religion, and fails to emphasize the tremendous good that has come about as well. I'm talking about things like charity work, the establishment of hospitals. There's a reason why many hospitals are called St. Luke's. The establishment of schools and universities. Many of the most prominent universities in the United States were started for religious reasons, and so forth and so on. Heck, science itself came about because critical thinkers, natural philosophers, wanted to make sense of the universe and more fully appreciate the majesty and grandeur of God's creation. He also fails to acknowledge the tremendous evil that has come about when you attempt to remove religion, and even as he wishes that religion would go away. He even goes so far as to say that the only reason why any rational person would praise religion would be to appease a powerful enemy. Those are not the words of someone who's interested in providing careful, balanced, nuanced views. There are great many other problems with his writings. I just wanted to talk about some of these major problems right now. His books are very popular, but they exhibit a lot of tremendously sloppy thinking, and I'm not just saying that alone. That's also been the observation of critical thinkers such as philosophers, including atheistic philosophers who are in his camp. Michael Ruse said he was embarrassed by the God Delusion. I don't blame him.